Today we're going to be talking about two holidays that are sort of on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of popular awareness and observance. One is called Hanukkah, which is very observed, certainly in the American context. And the other is called Tu B'Shvat, which if you haven't had a kid in Sunday school since the late 90s, you might have never heard of Tu B'Shvat, or almost barely. And if you were in a less Zionist household, you might not have heard of it either because it was co-opted by the Zionist movement at a certain point, as we'll talk about. But these two holidays have something in common, and that is that they're both non-biblical holidays. They're holidays that were not put into the mainstream of Jewish tradition in the earliest sources. There's no mention of Hanukkah anywhere in the Bible. Of course, it happens post-biblical, according to the biblical chronology. There might be some allusions to the persecution that led to the Maccabean revolt in the book of Daniel, which is thought to be one of the latest books canonized. Even though it's set earlier, it was probably written much later. And the books of Maccabees that the Maccabees themselves wrote did not get included in the Hebrew Bible. However, they were included in the Catholic Bible. So I guess calling it non-biblical depends on which biblical canon you're defining as normative. But from a Jewish perspective, they're non-biblical holidays. And as we'll see with Tu B'Shvat, it also does not make it into the Hebrew Bible. It does have a mention in the Mishnah, which is an early rabbinic collection of teachings, where Hanukkah doesn't appear anywhere in the Mishnah either. It isn't until the Talmud that Hanukkah makes an appearance. So it doesn't show up in rabbinic literature until some 600 years after the events of the Maccabees took place. But we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. We're going to start with talking about Hanukkah, which, as I said, is one of the most observed holidays in the American Jewish context, and it's no mystery why that's the case. First of all, it happens around the same time as another major holiday, Diwali. No, not Diwali. Christmas. It happens in a time of year when people are doing holiday events, New Year's. It's at a time of year where light is an asset because it's getting darker and darker out. It's also a home holiday and not a synagogue-based holiday. It's built around food. It's of a limited period of time, unlike Shabbat, which happens every week. So there are a lot of assets in Hanukkah's favor. And it's also, by the way, a relatively minor holiday in the rabbinic calendar. There are no restrictions on what work you're allowed to do. You can pitch in the World Series on Hanukkah if you were playing baseball that time of year. It wouldn't be a conflict at all because it's not a holiday that requires you to not work. There are a few extra blessings and some extra Torah readings, but really it's not a major burden at all. You light some lights, you spin a dreidel, right? It's not a major production. As I mentioned, this video slideshow was originally created by our partners in Israel, Menorah, and I'm grateful that they gave me the original for the PDF so I could make some adjustments for what I need to for this purpose. So Hanukkah is thought of as a unifying Jewish experience. It's a rebellion against oppression. It's affirming a positive Jewish identity against those who would suppress it. And so there's a claim that the many branches of the menorah come together in one focus, and therefore it is an expression of Jewish unity. But the reality is that Jews are very divided, and Hanukkah is no exception. In fact, if you learn the real story of Hanukkah, it's much more a story of division. So from that initial model of a menorah, which is sort of the classical model. Oops, I wanted to go backwards. I don't know. Oh, that's why. This is the classical model of the menorah with the 8 candles at one level and one light a little bit raised or separated from the others. That's the shamash, the lighting candle. That's the stereotypical design, but if you look at the next one, you'll see it's very different. There are circles all over the place, and things are similar, but again, very different. And after all, that makes sense because there are many different ways to be Jewish, different beliefs, languages, countries, and of course, people are different from other people. So we can't even agree on when we're supposed to light the candles because we're all in different time zones. And then there's the questions of lighting it in space above the Arctic Circle, all these questions that rabbis have to debate. But we have to realize that Hanukkah is not really a festival of light as much as it's a festival of darkness. This is a description that Arthur Waskow presents in his wonderful book, Seasons of Our Joy, where he points out that if you look at the cycle of the moon, you'll see this is a typical moon cycle. It's actually 29 and a half days as it works out. But remember that Jewish months are designed around the moon. So a new moon is always the first of a Jewish month. day of the week doesn't matter in this case. And the end of a Jewish month, be it the 29th or 30th day, is the end of the moon cycle when it's very, very dark out. And so if you started a holiday on the 25th of a Jewish month and then counted forward 8 days, you would go 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 1, 2. And then you'd have the first sliver of the new moon coming out on the 3rd. So, I'm sorry, the 3rd the second would be done. So you'd just be at the beginning of a new moon cycle, but you would be going through the darkest phase of the month. And then if you chose the moon cycle that's closest to the winter solstice, which is the longest night of the year, you're actually choosing the darkest nights of the year, the darkest and longest nights. Because if you just picked the winter solstice, it could be a full moon, right? But if you pick the new moon closest to the winter solstice, it's going to be the longest, almost darkest nights there are. So really, they chose almost the darkest nights. But remember, the Jewish calendar begins at night. The days begin at night in Jewish counting. So it makes sense to cycle it to the moon cycle and to a darkness festival if your goal is to highlight the contrast of creating light. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Well, there are a number of reasons why, and we're going to explore them. I'm going to give you them in order of historic appearance. So our first source, and our first option, comes from the first book of Maccabees. I've taken selections from chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 4. You're welcome to look it up and read the whole thing. It's actually very interesting. And this is most likely written around the year 100 BCE. And the Maccabean revolt itself was probably around 165 BCE. So this is written, a generation and a half after. There may have been people around who were alive at the time of the events described here, but it was also a book that was commissioned by the Maccabees themselves. So we have to take it with a grain of salt. This is the court history version of it. It's not an academic historian or a hostile historian, so they might have left out certain details or included some to make the story more dramatic. So the very beginning described how the ruler of Syria, which at the time was a Greek ruler, a descendant of the Greek general Antiochus. Antiochus was one of Alexander's general and took command of Syria, and Antiochus and Ptolemy, who had taken command of Egypt, were warring back and forth. At one time, the land of Israel was under the control of the Ptolemies, and that's when a lot of Jews moved to Alexandria, which was the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire. And then it ultimately got taken over by the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. And at the time of the persecution, it was Seleucid's great-great-great-great-grandson, Antiochus IV, who was in charge. And so in those days, there went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen around us. For since we departed from them, we've had much sorrow." People were so forward therein, they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinance of the heathen. They built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, the gymnasium, the gymnasium, according to the customs of the heathen, and they made themselves uncircumcised. And because, of course, the Greeks did not circumcise, and the Jews looked different in the naked gymnasium where men were exercising. And they forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mischief. I do have to point out at this point, one of the provocations that causes the Maccabean rebellion is the building of a gymnasium for athletics in Jerusalem. And when the Zionist movement in the 1920s and 30s decided they wanted to create a Jewish version of the Olympics, what did they call it? The Jewish Olympics are called the Maccabee Games. and the Olympics and Greek athletics was exactly what the Maccabees hated. So it's just one of those fascinating ironies of history, how things develop. So Antiochus, according to this, wrote to his whole kingdom that they should be one people. Everyone should leave their separate laws and follow the commandment of the king. And many Israelites consented to his religion. They sacrificed to idols. They profaned the Sabbath. The messengers from the king went to Jerusalem to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices in the temple, to profane the Sabbath and festival days, to pollute the sanctuary, set up new altars and groves of holy trees and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beast, leave their children uncircumcised, and forget the law, the Torah. And whoever would not do it according to the commandment of the king would die. Now, this persecution is what's alluded to in the book of Daniel, and it is reflected in some other sources contemporaneous to the era, and it is very unusual. Most Hellenistic kings were sort of live and let live. It wasn't worth the grief to try to impose a formal and rigid Hellenism on everybody. You'd sort of lure them in by attraction, and they would gradually Hellenize on their own, as was happening in the first part of this chapter. But this persecution was unusual in its severity, and it was reacted to by the Hebrews. So now on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side and burnt incense at the door in the streets. And when they had torn in pieces the book of the law they found, so they were actually destroying Torah scrolls, they burned them with fire. Anyone found with the book of the law or committed to the law was put to death. And this was done to the Israelites that were found in the city. And then on the 25th of that month, on the 25th of Kislev, they sacrificed on the idol altar they had built, which was built on the altar of God. And they put to death certain women that had circumcised their children. And they hanged the infants around their neck and rifled their houses and killed those that had circumcised them. Now some in Israel had resolved not to eat any unclean thing. They would die rather than be defiled, and so they died. And so there was a great suffering in Israel. I mean, this image of the women killed with their babies around their necks just because they dared to circumcise them is really, really brutal. But do note the date, the 25th day of that month of Kislev. We'll see that date show up again. So Mattathias and his sons tear their clothes, they put on sackcloth, they mourn. They're from a town called Modi'in, which is in the hill country outside of Jerusalem. They're sort of the pious hillbillies, so to speak, as opposed to the urban sophisticates who are more open to the gym and assimilation and acculturation in Jerusalem or in the coastal cities. Now the king's officers came to Mattathias and said, "You're a ruler in this area." He was a priest. "You're strengthened with your sons. You come and fulfill the king's commandment, and then you'll be honored with silver and gold." But Mattathias said no, and when he stopped speaking, one of the Jews came out in the sight of all to sacrifice at the altar. And when he saw this, Mattathias was inflamed with zeal, and he could not hold back his anger, and so he slew the Jew. He slew the Jewish man on the altar. And also he slew the king's commissioners who was making people sacrifice. And he pulls down the altar. And so he dealt zealously for the Torah of God, just like Pinchas did in a story in the book of Numbers, where he kills a Jewish man who is desecrating the sanctuary. So he's transformed by his zeal. He cries out, "Whoever is zealous of the law and wants to maintain the covenant, follow me." And many of his followers are gathered to him. They go to the hill countries to fight. And they go around the cities and the towns, and they pull down the altars. Whatever children they found within Israel uncircumcised, they circumcised them themselves. I don't know if they asked, but they did it. They also pursued after the proud men, and the work prospered in their hand. They recovered the law and did not allow the sinner to triumph. And so they recapture Jerusalem finally. They take out the old defiled altars, and they took new whole stones according to the law and built a new altar. They made up the sanctuary that was within the temple and hallowed the courts. They made new vessels. Into the temple they brought the candlestick. Now the Hebrew word for candlestick is a menorah. And in fact the word ner, which means candle, is built into the word. Just like candlestick or candelabra has candle in it, a menorah has the ner in it. And you might say, what? How could they have a menorah before Hanukkah? Well, the truth is there was this kind of menorah, which is a 7-branched menorah, which was simply a candelabra. And it had 7 lights for the 7 days of the week. It was part of the basic architecture of the temple. And so there already was a place to light lights, but it doesn't have the 9 lights, the 8 plus 1 that the Chanukiah has. This is the original menorah. You might also see this on the seal of the modern state of Israel. So they brought that menorah, that candlestick, and the altar of burnt offerings, the incense in the table. They burned the incense. They put the loaves on the table. They finished all the work they had begun to make. Now on the 25th of the 9th month in Kislev, in the 148th year, again this is about 162, if the revolt starts 165, they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law on the new altar of burnt offerings that they had made. On the same time and same day, the heathen had profaned it. Even in that, it was dedicated with songs and citherns and harps and cymbals. So who picked the date of Hanukkah? It wasn't the Maccabees. They are changing the holiday from a defiling holiday to a rededication holiday. In fact, the word Hanukkah means to dedicate. So they are rededicating the temple, and they're doing it on the precise day that it had been defiled. And one professor I had pointed out that one of the major holidays in the Seleucid calendar was a celebration of the king's birthday. And so it may well have been that the king's birthday was the 25th of Kislev, and we're still celebrating it by lighting candles, even if we hated that particular king. Again, ironies of history. There was very great gladness among the people, because the reproach of the heathen was put away, and Judas and his brothers and the whole congregation of Israel ordained the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season for year to year by the space of 8 days, from the 25th of the month of Kislev, with mirth and gladness. Now, two odd things you might notice here. The first is, what about the oil story? There's no mention anywhere here of a miracle of the lights, where there's enough oil for 1 day, it lasts for 8 days. The second thing you might notice here is in the very first year, they're declaring it as an 8-day celebration. And from season to season, keep it 8 days. Why 8? It's a week plus 1, maybe. Or maybe because this was dedicating a temple, they went back to the sources to find out, what do you do when you dedicate a temple? And one of the sources they could draw on was the historical book of 1 Kings, where Solomon dedicates the first temple. And if you read that description, the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the Lord's house. He held the feast at that time, 7 days and 7 more days, 14 days. And on the 8th day, he sent the people away. So it was a 7-day festival with an 8th day closing. When you dedicate a temple, well, maybe that's what you do. You make it an 8-day dedication event. And here you have depicted a relief from the Arch of Titus, which describes the destruction of the second temple, that same temple the Maccabees are rededicating. And you'll notice one of the objects they're carrying away is that very same 7-candled menorah that was relit. Now, a second option for why we celebrate Hanukkah is from the book of 2nd Maccabees, which might actually be a little bit earlier than the book of 1st Maccabees. They're canonized in a different order than when they're written sometimes. And in this case, it describes a different reasoning for why 8 days. Just like the previous, it gives you the preface of the revolt and cleaning out the temple. On the same day the sanctuary was profaned, on that very day, on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, they complete the cleansing, and they kept 8 days with joy in the manner of the holiday of Sukkot, remembering how just recently during Sukkot they were wandering in the mountains. So they carried branches with leaves and fair boughs and palms and offered songs of thanksgiving, and they made a rule they should keep these days every year. And notice again, it's 8 days in year number 1. But why 8 days in this case? It's because it's an echo of Sukkot. And you see here an example of an oil-based menorah where you would have separate pieces of string that would be the wicks for the different nights, and then one central candle, the shamas, coming out the main hole, which is also where you would add the oil. And you see the agricultural motifs there that reflect Sukkot. Because when you read the description of Sukkot, which we did just recently in this class, you remember it's a 7-day festival with an 8th day as a closing day. So why 8 days for Hanukkah? Again, no miracle of the lights, but maybe it's 8 days because it's Sukkot out of season. Like Christmas in July or whatever. It was Sukkot in Kislev instead. Now, there's a third option for why Jews celebrate Hanukkah, and this dates to a historian named Josephus, who lives in the 1st century of the Common Era. So now we're talking about 250 years or so after the Maccabees lived. Now, he did have access to archival sources and other materials that we do not. And when Josephus describes the Maccabean revolt and its end, similarly, he says, on the 25th day is when they lit the lamps on the menorah and offered the sacrifices. And it was the same day their divine worship had stopped 3 years before. And so Judah celebrated the festival of restoring the sacrifice of the temple for, again, year 1, 8 days. They were so glad at the revival of their customs, they decided to establish forever a festival for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and we call it lights. I suppose the reason was because our liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and so they called it lights. Well, let's see. End of the year, darkest nights, close to the solstice. I wonder if there are any other cultures that have ever thought of lighting lights that time. Of course there are. Of course there are. So maybe there had been some kind of a more primitive animistic ritual of lighting lights to show the sun how to burn brighter. Just like in northern climates, they would take the magic trees that were evergreen and burn them to release the magic power to help the sun burn brighter, which later became candles on the tree, which later became strings of lights that are impossible to untangle. So this phenomenon, this human phenomenon of lighting lights in the winter is universal. I mean, even the most bah humbug anti-Christmas Jewish person appreciates when they put lights on the trees because it gets dark so early, it's easier to see, and it uplifts you a little bit. And there's even a source from later literature that suggests there might have been some truth to this. This is in Avodah Zarah, which is a section of the Talmud about idol worship. When primitive Adam saw the day getting gradually shorter, he says, woe is me. Remember, it's getting winter, days are shorter, and Adam was just created at Rosh Hashanah, so this is his first winter. He saw the days getting shorter, and he said, woe is me, because I have sinned, the world around me is getting darkened, and returning to the state of tohu vavohu, chaos and confusion, that it was before creation. This is the kind of death. Remember, he was told, after you eat from the tree, you will die, but he didn't know how. So maybe this is it. So Adam started keeping an 8 days fast, right around the time of that solstice. But as he the solstice, I don't know why it says equinox here. But as he observed the winter solstice and noticed the days getting increasingly longer, he said, this is the world's course. This is just the way things work. And so he set forth to keep an 8 days festivity. In the following year, he appointed both as festivals, and now he fixed them for the sake of heaven, but the heathens made them to worship idols. Again, this is talking about a common human heritage of lighting lights when it gets dark out. And so maybe this Nerot holiday that Josephus is described as also being alluded to in some ways by the rabbis, and maybe the Maccabees simply reclaimed or repurposed a holiday that already existed to make it about the dedication of the temple instead of about the solstice. So that's certainly a possibility. Now, the fourth option for why we celebrate Hanukkah is the one you've probably heard of before, but it only appears for its first time in the Babylonian Talmud around 400 of the Common Era. And it doesn't even have its own section. It's thrown in as an aside comment when you're talking about Shabbat and lighting Shabbat candles. And they say, well, if we're talking about candles, we might as well talk a little bit about Hanukkah. What is the reason for Hanukkah? When the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein, and the Hasmonean dynasty defeated them. They searched and found only one container of oil with the seal of the high priest. Had only enough for 1 day's light, but a miracle happened. And they lit the menorah for 8 days. And the next year, these were made a holiday with reciting Hallel prayers and Thanksgiving prayers and so on. So this is the rabbinic version that doesn't show up until much later. As I mentioned, it doesn't appear in rabbinic literature. It doesn't appear in the Mishnah, that first collection. Only in the Talmud we get this aside comment about how this holiday appeared. And it's a very minor holiday. It's, again, no requirement to stop work, no formal rituals or recitations. There's no equivalent to a lulav. I mean, they could have taken the Sukkot thing and made you do Sukkot twice because of that Maccabean source, but the rabbis didn't include the Maccabees books in their sources, so they didn't draw on that. One of the reasons for this, by the way, is the rabbis didn't necessarily like the Maccabees very much, because the Maccabees had fought back against an outside power, and the rabbis were the victims twice of massive revolts against the Romans that were totally crushed. First in the year 70 of the Common Era, and then again in 132 to 135 of the Common Era. So they did not want any military victories attempted, and they didn't want any military defeats for sure. So they wanted to de-emphasize the militarism of the Maccabees. They were also upset with the Maccabees because the Maccabees started as wonderful pietists with names like Matityahu and Yehuda, great Jewish names. After a couple generations, they began getting names like Hyrcanos and Aristobulus and even Alexander, like the worst of the Greeks. So the Maccabees themselves had Hellenized and been corrupted by the power. They made themselves high priests when they weren't entitled to be. They declared themselves to be high priests and kings, and they weren't from the line of David at all, so that was a heresy. So the rabbis were not pleased with the Maccabees at all. Now, by adding this story, you can see how they've de-emphasized the Maccabees. They mentioned the Hasmonean dynasty defeated them. Yeah, they won a victory. But what really happened that was important was the miracle of the light. So the real hero of the story is not Judah Maccabee killing the elephant. The real hero of the story is God because of the miracle. So it refocuses the attention of the holiday onto the miracle story and onto God and away from the Maccabees. So why celebrate Hanukkah? That's the miracle story. And in fact, there was a tradition that not only should you light the menorah, but you should display your menorah in your doorway or in your windows as a public demonstration of the miracle and remembering the miracle. In fact, some old Jewish houses actually have niches cut into the doorposts so that you could fit a menorah in there to display it during the holiday. Then there's a whole debate over whether you have to display it if it's dangerous to mark your house as Jewish, and again, we have to deal with the realities of living in a non-Jewish world. Now, why do people celebrate Hanukkah today? It may be none of these reasons. It may be because this is a season when everybody's giving gifts to each other because of this holiday. This is why Hanukkah has gotten so much more important. When you ask people what are the major Jewish holidays, they'll probably say Hanukkah and Passover because those are the ones they do. Even though they are Hanukkah certainly, Passover was a major holiday, but Hanukkah was always a minor holiday. It was behind Passover, it was behind Sukkot, it was behind Shavuot, it was behind Rosh Hashanah, it was behind Yom Kippur, it was even behind Shabbat. And that happens 54 times a year. 52 times a year in the Jewish calendar. So the reality is that the surrounding culture has an impact on how we celebrate Hanukkah. But there are other reasons why Jews have celebrated Hanukkah that are positive, which include all the fun things about it. So you can see some examples here. As one example, you have the game of the dreidel with 4 letters on it. Now, you may think you know what the dreidel stands for. Traditionally, it's presented as an acronym for Nes Gadol Haya Sham, a great miracle happened there. But actually, we found from the Middle Ages 4-sided tops in Germany that have the Roman alphabet letters N, G, H, and S on them. Now, were they borrowing from the Jews? Actually, it goes the other way around, because those letters on those 4-sided tops represented the rules of the game. When you spin an N, you get nicht, nothing. In Yiddish, nicht. If you dial an H or a hey, you get halb, half. If you get a G or a gimel, you get ganze, the whole thing. If you get a shin or stellein, or an S, you have to put one in. It's the rules of the game. And later on, someone came up with the Hebrew acronym for Nes Gadol Haya Sham. Originally, it was Nisht, Ganze, Halb, and Stellein. Or people sometimes said Shittein, which means to throw one in, but people sometimes react to that in English. There's even a modified version of the dreidel now in Israel where it has a pei instead of a shin because they want to say Nes Gadol Haya Po, a great miracle happened here. But to understand how ahistorical a lot of people's celebrations are, I remember hearing, even in my humanistic Sunday school, the legend that when the Maccabees were undergoing persecution, the Jews were undergoing persecution, they kept studying Torah in secret. And one of the things they did was they had these dreidels handy so that if the Greek soldiers came in, they could say, oh, we were just getting together to play these dreidel games, these spin top games. We weren't doing anything wrong at all. We weren't studying Torah. But you have to ask, what was on those tops? A great miracle will happen here? Because the miracle hasn't happened yet during the persecution. So, people think, oh, it's Hanukkah time. They're spinning dreidels. But wait a minute. In fact, the dreidel doesn't appear in Jewish life until much later, until the Middle Ages, where they borrow it from German practice. I think it was called a teetotum or something like that in medieval Germany. In Hebrew, it's called a sevivon, which means something that spins around. So, histovev is to spin around. So you've got the dreidel. You've got the gelt, the chocolate coins, which also in many houses, by the way, becomes a tradition of giving tzedakah. That you don't just get money and gifts, but you also give as part of Hanukkah. And that's a positive tradition. You have the eating of fried and oil foods. Who's going to argue with that, right? You've got latkes, which you can see in the bottom left, with applesauce available. Some people like them with sour cream. You can have an argument over which is better between the two. And in Israel and in parts of the Sephardic diaspora, they ate something called sufganiyot, which are jelly donuts that, of course, are also fried in oil. There's a whole series of musical traditions added to this, family traditions like lighting the Hanukkahs. You see this family lighting it here. In Israel, actually, they've innovated some new traditions, including a torchlit marathon from Jerusalem all the way to Modi'in, which is where the Maccabees lived. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Again, we've talked about the dedication of the temple. That was the Maccabees' original version. The holiday of Sukkot and the Maccabees' victory as reflecting Sukkot out of season, or when they were traveling in the mountains, they didn't have time to celebrate it correctly. There's the idea of lights, and because it's dark out, we light lights as a universal human phenomenon. There's the miracle story from the Talmud. There's the Jewish experience of competition and wanting presents, and there's the Jewish experience of family and food and memories, which are very positive. And number 7 is blank because you might have your own reasons for celebrating Hanukkah in your family. But that also leads to other questions. How many lights should we light each day? I mean, in theory, you could light 8 lights each day, right? Or 1 light each day. Why do it the way we do it? Well, some options that Talmud presents is you could have 1 light each night per household, or 1 for each member of the household. And you want to have different lights each night, but how many? We can't even agree on how to begin, because the house of Hillel says, or the house of Shammai says, on the first day you light 8 lights, and thereafter you reduce it. But the house of Hillel says on the first day 1 light is lit, and after they are increased. And there were 2 arguments about this. One says that Beit Shammai says it corresponds to the days to come. So you have 8 days, then you have 7 days left, and you have 6 days left as you count down. And Beit Hillel corresponds to the days that are already gone. But another one says the reason for Beit Shammai is it corresponds to the bulls of Sukkot, where you start with 8 and then 7 and 6, and you sort of count down, where Beit Hillel's reason is you promote in holiness but don't reduce. You want to get more and more and more light. I will also say that if the goal is imitative magic to show the sun how to burn brighter, adding lights makes more sense. And lest you think that the sun connection is sort of strained, remember the name of that central candle, the one used to light all the others? In Yiddish it's called a shamus, but in Hebrew it's a shamash. The word shemesh is sun. So the shamash is almost exactly the same word as shemesh for sun. It's the lighter that does all the lighting. So here's an example of if you had a Shammai and a Hillel in one house, you might go in opposite directions for the number of candles for the very same night. Who is lighting it? Well, here you have a variety of people lighting them, including even a presidential menorah lighting in the bottom left. Where do we light the menorah? Well, that might affect how you design it. Again, you might think Jews lived in a bubble. They didn't care what their neighbors did. They weren't affected by the surrounding society. But here are some examples. Here is a menorah built in the south of France for an oil menorah. But notice the design that reflects the Chartres Cathedral in that region. Here is a synagogue that was one of those beautiful wooden synagogues in Poland, unfortunately destroyed by the Nazis. And you can see a menorah built modeled on that synagogue. Or here's another one showing the architecture typical in Tunisia, and here's an Algerian version of a menorah that again shows a much more Islamic-inflected artistic sensibility in this. And you put little oil cups in those little alcoves there, but they look very much like the alcoves you'd see in monumental architecture. Here's one more example. This is in Venice, and you can see how some of those art details are decorated, and again, the architecture is reflected in an Algerian menorah. But of course, we're not confined to that. We live in a free society, right? So we can do all kinds of creative things. There's a wine stopper menorah, a Noah's Ark menorah. You can use a banana as a menorah. And then the one on the bottom right is called Menorahsaurus Rex. Menorahsaurus Rex is the name of that one. Here's some other examples with a Lego style. I like the sort of minimalist style. On the upper right, you've got a chess set, you've got flowers. You could even have this set, which is called a Chanukkit, which has a single candle for the shamus, and then you light just candles, and they burn down to the bottom, and that's it. There's actually no menorah itself to light. You could light oil itself. There are still oil menorahs out there that do work. You could just light the matches. Who said it had to be wax? And there was even an app at one time that the Jewish Museum in New York put out called Light My Fire, where you could actually light the candles on your screen and use that for celebrating Hanukkah. Well, so what do humanistic Jews do with this inheritance? Well, let's pause for a moment here. Let me ask if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about that survey of the traditional approach, and then we'll turn to talking a little bit about how humanistic Jews celebrate, and then go on to talk about Tu B'Shvat as well. It's all crystal clear? Great. So what I want to do now is I'm going to share with you the example of a home Hanukkah service that our congregation uses. We give it out for free on our website, and we hand it out every year to our families so that they can use it as well. What we find is that it works very well because it's flexible. It gives you many options as opposed to telling you only one way to do things. And in fact, the introduction is very explicit with this. Do what you want, what's more meaningful to you, and that will make it more personal. So I included a quick history of Hanukkah so people understand what we talked about in our discussion tonight. And we give some options for candlelighting blessings. So some people like to have a special blessing on the first night of Hanukkah. So one option is our movement song Efo Ori, because we're lighting lights, or here's a version by Daniel Friedman that includes a version was called the Shehechianu, but instead of praising God, it's praising the light in the world and in people that has brought us to this time. And you can sing this to the traditional melodies. Baruch ha'or ba'olam, Baruch ha'or ba'adam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. That's the first night. Or again, another version that you could do by Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, more in English. And then for each night, as you light the candles, there is a traditional blessing. It says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, our God, the Lord of the universe. Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his commandments. V'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Chanukah, and commanded us to light Hanukkah candles. The rabbis actually debate this in the section on blessings, where they say, wait a minute, where did he command us to light Hanukkah candles? Because it's nowhere in the Torah, right? This is way post-Torah. How could he command us to light Hanukkah candles? Well, the answer they give is that in the Torah it says, you will appoint judges and they will tell you what to do. So if we, the rabbis, say it's commanded, it's commanded. A little bit of chutzpah there by the rabbis. But that blessing is, again, one of the few blessings people will know because it's done in the home and it's done with their kids and they hear it sung, so it sticks in their mind. So we have humanistic versions of these. You can do this again with just Baruch ha'or ba'olam. Baruch ha'or ba'olam, Baruch ha'or ba'adam, Baruch ha'or ba'chanukah, Baruch ha'or ba'chanukah. Or here's one that's part Hebrew and part English, where it has, we light these candles in our home tonight, and we hope that in the world light will shine for all. And again, another version that has Baruch ha'or ba'olam, and then come gather round and light the menorah, as we say, lehadlik ner shel Chanukah. So again, they're designed to be sung to the melody to get that traditional echo, but with words that we can agree with. And then for each night, we have a number of versions of ways you can explore the holidays. So this is one that I wrote called A Journey Through Hanukkah, where it talks about different themes. First night we talk about the human phenomenon of light and how we need fire. It gives a bit of the story of the Maccabees and where they sometimes went overboard. You know, that forced circumcision thing, they didn't stop. Once they rededicated the temple, they actually conquered a whole other people and forcibly circumcised them too. So the Maccabees are not necessarily the ACLU heroes that we think of them to be. So this talks about that a bit. Then this adds the story of the legend of the lights and why. The idea of having a menorah versus a Chanukiah that can have 7 lights or more, how many lights to light each night, and the idea of being the shamas, that we can be the light that lights other lights. Talking about food and the fried foods, the dreidel game and where it comes from originally, as well as the later versions of it, the idea of giving and receiving as a positive tradition, and then finally talking about Hanukkah as a heritage. It's connecting us to our past and hopefully connecting us to a future as well. So each night you would read each section and they'd sort of give you a theme for the night. Another version that Rabbi Daniel Friedman wrote is different values. You could do it that way. There's an even simpler version with values written by Marilyn Rowans. Here's a Yiddish version that was adapted by Herschel Hartman, who's a leader of our movement in Los Angeles, that gives a Yiddish version of something to think about for each night. And some songs at the end, because it's a holiday. What would be a holiday without singing? And again, the songs are somewhat creative, because this song, Mi Yamalel Gvurot Yisrael, is actually quoting from the Bible, but changed it. Because in the Bible it says, Mi Yamalel Gvurot Adonai, who can we tell the great deeds of God? And here they shifted it to, who can we tell the great deeds of Israel? So again, a shift in the message from in a more secular direction. And this song as well, Maccabees of old, is to the melody of a traditional song called Ma'oz Tzur, which is the sort of praising the rock of Israel, aka God, but putting it in words about the Maccabees, you have the same melody, but again, words that we can agree with. Okay, so that's a quick tour through Hanukkah and how we celebrate it. Any thoughts, comments, questions? I mean, you can understand why Hanukkah became important in America. Maybe I'll ask you, why do you think Hanukkah became extra important for the Zionist movement and in the early state of Israel? Why is it called Maccabi Tel Aviv as the main basketball team?
Well, I would say because it's an actual historical event, even if some of it's embellished, and we won, at least short term.
We fought back and we won.
Hey.
Right? You know, that's part of the ethos of Zionism is we're going to fight back. We're not going to take it lying down anymore. We're going to, leave if we have to leave or fight back if we need to fight back. So Ron is asking where to find it. You can actually find it on the Kol Hadash website. If you go to the main website, you'll see a tab at the top. I think it says Celebrate, and then you can find Hanukkah in there. And on that page, there'll be a link for that home Hanukkah service. Or you can always email our administrator, Jeremy, just info@kolhadash.com, and he'll be happy to email you a PDF of that. Again, we hand it out at the Sunday school, but I think we mailed it out to everybody last year who were members when we were in sort of COVID lockdown. We'll also have some at our, we're hoping to do a Hanukkah candle lighting for the community sometime in December for the brave who are willing to come indoors and do something together. Because lighting outside doesn't work. It's too windy. I hope that you do have a good Hanukkah this year. I had one person who heard me talk about Hanukkah once and said, "You ruined it." What do you mean it's just a story? What do you mean they made it up 550 years after, 600 years after the Maccabees? How am I supposed to celebrate this anymore? And I said, well, look, part of what you celebrate is the tradition of celebrating it. You do it as an echo of Jewish tradition over the centuries. I mean, when I light menorahs, if I screw in light bulbs or flip on the switch for an LED-based menorah, I'm doing it because it's meaningful to me, and because I have memories of doing it growing up. And if I say a different text when I light those candles, or I sing different songs, or I give gifts instead of getting gifts, there's all kinds of ways to make it more meaningful for you. A couple examples that my family has done. We often will take bets on which candle will last the longest. Some families do this. We even try turning off all the lights and sort of imagining if we only had to live by candlelight, how would it work? You can, of course, play dreidel. You can experiment with other fried foods. In our congregation, we often have samosas for Hanukkah because we have an Indian family that's part of our congregation, or half part Indian, part Jewish. So they brought samosas because they're fried in oil. So why not? It's another fried in oil food. One night in our family, because we take the giving seriously, we have one night of charity gifts where each member of the family chooses a charity and we make an online donation for them. And we also have a night we call Hanukkah, because there's an organization called Kiva that gives microloans to people in the third world. So we make a few Kiva loans once a year on Hanukkah as one of our nights. It's Hanukkah night. Other families have family dinners, or one of the interesting twists is in families that have both Jewish and Christian heritage in the family, they're negotiating the Christmas and Hanukkah juxtaposition. Because some years it works out great. Hanukkah runs right over Christmas time, like it will next year, and so they can just celebrate them at the same time. In other years, they're very different. This year, Hanukkah comes at the beginning of December, and of course, it's the 25th of Kislev every year in the Jewish calendar, but in the general calendar, it's in the beginning of December, so it'll be over long before Christmas happens. So in those households, do they do them at their separate times, or do they always have them at the same time to be able to celebrate both simultaneously. Some families have a Christmas tree that's just a Christmas tree, and others put menorahs and dreidels on their Christmas tree because it's reflecting the whole family in both sides. And every household is going to make their own choices with regard to that. And what's meaningful to them works for them. You can even now buy Christmaka or Hanukkah cards where people are celebrating both, and they've even combined the holidays. So, quick overview of Hanukkah and Tu B'Shvat. Hopefully you found this interesting. And any last questions or comments? I did see a chat mentioning that French fries now qualify as Hanukkah food.